Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your bed and let the weight of the day slip away, we're going to journey back through time to one of humanity's most profound stories, a tale of divine judgment and mercy, of a righteous man who built the impossible, and of waters that both destroyed and renewed the world. This is the complete story of Noah's Ark, but not just the familiar scenes of animals marching two by two. We'll explore what led to that first raindrop, what happened during those long months afloat, and how the world began again after the waters receded. Before we embark on this ancient voyage together, if you find comfort in these bedtime stories that blend history, faith, and wonder, consider subscribing and letting us know where you're listening from tonight. We're building a global community of those who find peace in these timeless narratives. So pull your covers close, let your breathing slow, and prepare to drift into a world where divine voices spoke directly to human hearts, where the impossible became necessary, and where hope floated above the chaos on wooden beams sealed with pitch. The world before the flood was not the world we know today. Picture, if you will, valleys that had never known cities, mountains that had never echoed with the sound of war, and rivers that flowed clear and unpolluted towards seas that sparkled under unmarked skies. This was a younger earth, its soil rich and dark, its air sweet with the fragrance of flowers whose names are now lost to time. In those distant days, people lived differently than we do now. Their lives stretched across centuries rather than decades. Fathers watched their great-great-grandchildren grow old, while they themselves remained vigorous. Knowledge accumulated across these extended lifespans, wisdom deepening like wine in ancient vessels. Craftsmen perfected their arts over hundreds of years. Farmers learned the secrets of soil and season through countless harvests. The descendants of Adam had spread across this pristine landscape, establishing communities in fertile valleys and beside flowing streams. They built homes of stone and timber, tended flocks of sheep and herds of cattle, and discovered the arts of metalworking and music. From their workshops came tools of bronze and instruments of joy. Their cities, though small by our standards, buzzed with the energy of human creativity and ambition. Yet something had begun to change in the human heart. The original harmony between creator and creation had started to fracture. Where once there had been gratitude, pride began to take root. Where once there had been cooperation, competition emerged. The strong began to exploit the weak. Justice became a commodity to be bought and sold rather than a principle to be upheld. Violence crept into human relationships like poison in a well. Arguments that once would have been settled with words now ended in bloodshed. Leaders who should have protected became oppressors. The vulnerable found no sanctuary. Children learned cruelty before they learned kindness. The earth itself seemed to groan under the weight of human wickedness. As generations passed, the corruption deepened. What had begun as isolated incidents of wrongdoing became systemic evil. Communities that should have been havens became centers of exploitation. The very creativity that had produced beautiful art and useful tools now turned toward instruments of destruction and oppression. It was into this deteriorating world that Noah was born. His name meant rest or comfort, though the world around him offered little of either. From his earliest days, Noah walked a different path than his contemporaries. While others pursued wealth through dishonest means, Noah worked with his hands and dealt fairly with all. While others worshipped gods of their own making, Noah maintained his relationship with the Creator of all things. Noah's home stood somewhat apart from the nearest settlement, built on higher ground among ancient trees. It was a place of simplicity and peace, where the sound of flowing water and bird songs still drowned out the distant noise of human conflict. Here Noah lived with his wife, a woman of quiet strength and deep faith, and their 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The family followed rhythms that seemed increasingly old-fashioned to their neighbors. They rose with the sun and rested when darkness fell. They spoke truthfully in their business dealings. They cared for the elderly and helped the needy. They remembered the old stories and taught them to their children. Most importantly, they maintained their communion with the divine through regular prayer and sacrifice. As Noah aged, his hair silvering and his face lined by years of honest labor, he often found himself standing on the hill behind his home, looking out over the valley below. The smoke rising from distant settlements carried with it the sounds of conflict and the cries of the oppressed. His heart grew heavy as he witnessed the steady decline of human civilization. It was during one of these contemplative moments, as morning mist rose from the valley and the first light of dawn painted the eastern hills, that Noah first heard the voice that would change everything. Not audibly as one person speaks to another, but directly in his mind and heart, with a clarity that left no room for doubt. The divine presence that had walked with his ancestors Adam and Enoch now communicated with Noah, sharing both sorrow and purpose. The Creator had watched humanity's descent into corruption with growing grief, the violence that filled the earth, the systematic oppression of the weak by the strong, the complete abandonment of moral restraint. All of this caused divine heartbreak. Yet within this message of coming judgment lay seeds of hope. Noah had found favor in the eyes of the Almighty. His righteousness, though imperfect, stood out like a lighthouse in the growing darkness. Through him, life would be preserved. Through his family, humanity would continue. Through his obedience, the world would have another chance. The instructions that followed were precise and overwhelming. Noah was to build an ark, a vessel unlike anything the world had ever seen. The dimensions given would create a structure of staggering size, a floating city capable of housing not just his family, but representatives of all living creatures. This ark would become the bridge between the world that was and the world that would be. As Noah absorbed these instructions, he understood their implications. A flood was coming, not just any flood, but one that would cover the entire earth. The mountains themselves would disappear beneath the waters. Every breathing thing that lived on land would perish except for those preserved within the wooden walls of the ark. The weight of this knowledge pressed upon Noah's shoulders like a physical burden. He alone knew what was coming. He alone had been chosen to preserve life through the catastrophe. The responsibility was staggering, the task seemingly impossible, yet the voice that had spoken carried such authority and love that doubt seemed unthinkable. That night Noah sat with his family around their evening fire and shared what he had received. He spoke quietly but clearly, watching their faces as the magnitude of his words settled upon them. His wife reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture of support that spoke louder than words. His sons exchanged glances, their expressions mixing fear with determination. Questions followed, as questions must. How long did they have? Where would they find enough wood? How could such a massive vessel be built by 8 people? How would they gather all the animals? The practical challenges seemed insurmountable, but Noah's response to each concern was the same quiet confidence that had sustained him through years of walking with God. They would begin with what they had, and trust that provision would come as needed. They would work steadily and faithfully, one day at a time. They would follow the instructions exactly as given and leave the results in divine hands. Most importantly, they would remember that the same power that had spoken the world into existence was now speaking to them, and that power would see them through. As the fire burned low and the family prepared for sleep, none of them could have imagined the years of labor that lay ahead, the mockery they would endure, or the profound loneliness of being the only ones who believed catastrophe was coming. They could not envision the day when animals would begin arriving at their wooden sanctuary, or the moment when the first drops of rain would begin to fall. But they had taken the first step on a journey that would carry them through the death of one world and into the birth of another, floating above the chaos on a vessel built by faith and sealed by divine promise. The work began at dawn the next morning, and with it came a transformation that would define the rest of their lives. Noah selected the first tree with the careful eye of a master craftsman, running his weathered hands along its bark, testing its straightness, measuring its girth. The cypress stood tall and proud, its wood known for its resistance to decay and water, perfect for what lay ahead. The sound of the axe biting into wood echoed across the hillside, a rhythmic percussion that would become the soundtrack of their days. Each stroke carried purpose. Each fallen tree brought them closer to salvation. Shem worked alongside his father, learning to read the grain of the wood, understanding how each piece would fit into the greater whole. Ham and Japheth hauled the felled timber, their muscles growing stronger with each passing week. Word of their unusual project spread quickly through the surrounding communities. At first, visitors came out of simple curiosity. A boat of such enormous proportions, being built so far from any navigable water, seemed like the folly of an aging man. They would stand at the edge of the worksite, pointing and whispering among themselves before departing with shaking heads and knowing smiles. But as weeks turned to months and the massive frame began to take shape, the whispers turned to open mockery. Groups of young men made regular pilgrimages to witness what they called Noah's madness, bringing wine and making sport of the family's dedication to their impossible task. They would call out questions designed to wound and suggestions meant to humiliate, their laughter carrying across the valley like the cries of scavenging birds. Noah rarely responded to these taunts. He would pause in his work sometimes, his eyes meeting those of his tormentors, with a mixture of sadness and determination. When he did speak, his words were simple invitations rather than arguments. "The flood is coming," he would say quietly. "There is still time to prepare." But his warnings fell on ears that had grown deaf to divine truth, hearts that had hardened against anything that challenged their comfortable assumptions about the world. The family's isolation deepened as the ark grew larger. Old friends stopped visiting, former trading partners found reasons to do business elsewhere, and even distant relatives began to avoid them at market gatherings. They had become figures of ridicule, cautionary tales told around evening fires about the dangers of religious fanaticism and the folly of taking ancient stories too literally. Yet the work continued, day after day, season after season. The lower deck took shape first, its massive timbers fitted together with joints so precise that no water could pass between them. Room after room was framed and finished, each space designed for specific purposes. Some would house the largest animals, others would store food and water. Still others would provide living quarters for the 8 souls who would ride out the coming catastrophe. The middle deck followed, another vast expanse of carefully crafted chambers. Here, smaller animals would find shelter, and here too, the family would store the seeds and grains that would one day replant a cleansed world. Windows were cut at regular intervals, positioned to provide light and ventilation, while keeping out the rain that would soon fall without ceasing. The upper deck presented the greatest challenge, requiring the lifting of massive beams to heights that tested both their engineering skills and their faith. But somehow, through combinations of levers and ramps, ropes and determination, each piece found its place. The roof took shape overhead, sloped and sealed to shed the waters that would fall from broken heavens. As the 3rd year of construction began, something remarkable started to happen. Animals began to appear at the edges of their property, not in great numbers at first, but in pairs that seemed drawn by an invisible hand. A couple of wolves would emerge from the forest and sit watching the work, their yellow eyes alert but showing no aggression toward the humans or each other. Foxes would appear and disappear like spirits, always in twos, always observing. The neighbors who witnessed these unusual gatherings grew quieter in their mockery. Even the most skeptical among them had to admit that something beyond normal was taking place. Wild animals simply did not behave this way, gathering peacefully around human habitation. Natural enemies sitting side by side without conflict. But rather than softening hearts, these supernatural signs seemed to harden them further. Fear replaced amusement in many eyes, fear of forces they could not understand or control. Some began to speak of Noah as a sorcerer, a man who had somehow learned to command the beasts of the field. Others suggested darker explanations, whispering about pacts with evil powers and unnatural knowledge. The family felt this growing hostility like a physical weight. Their children, now grown and married, struggled with the isolation and scorn. Ham's wife wept sometimes in the evening, mourning the friendships she had lost and the simple joys of community that had been stripped away. Japheth's children asked why other families laughed at their grandfather, why they could no longer play with the children from nearby farms. It was Noah's wife who held them together during these difficult times. Her quiet strength became the anchor that kept their family united when the pressures of their mission threatened to tear them apart. She would gather the women and children around her in the evenings, telling them stories of Abraham and Isaac, of Jacob and Joseph, reminding them that God's people had always walked difficult paths. The fourth year brought completion closer, and with it an intensification of both the supernatural signs and human opposition. More animals arrived daily now, their numbers growing until the hillside around the ark resembled a peaceful gathering of all creation. Lions lay down with lambs, bears walked alongside deer, and birds of every feather filled the trees with songs that seemed somehow more beautiful than any heard before. Yet even as these wonders multiplied, human hearts grew harder. Some began to organize against Noah and his family, speaking of driving them from the land or destroying their unholy work. Others proposed taking the animals by force, claiming such valuable beasts belonged to the community rather than to one man's delusion. It was during this time of growing tension that Noah received his final instructions. The loading would begin soon, he was told. The animals would come when called, entering the ark in orderly fashion according to divine direction. Clean animals would come in sevens, unclean in pairs, ensuring both preservation and provision for the sacrifices that would follow. The family made their final preparations with hearts that mixed anticipation with sorrow. They were ready to leave behind everything they had known, to trust their lives to wooden walls and divine promises. The ark stood completed, a testament to years of faithful labor, its pitched exterior gleaming darkly in the sunlight, its interior prepared to house the treasures of all creation. As the last supplies were loaded and the final tools stored away, Noah stood once more on the hill behind his home, looking out over the valley that had been their world. Smoke still rose from distant settlements, carrying the same sounds of human conflict that had grieved the Creator's heart. Soon, those sounds would be silenced, those fires extinguished, those struggles ended forever beneath waters that would reshape the face of the earth. But for now, in these final days before the deluge, life continued its ancient patterns. People woke and slept, worked and played, loved and fought, completely unaware that their world balanced on the edge of ending. Only 8 souls knew what was coming, and they waited with the patience of those who had learned to trust in promises that seemed impossible but had proven true. The gathering began on a morning when the air itself seemed to shimmer with anticipation. Noah woke before dawn, as had become his custom, but this time, something felt different. The very atmosphere carried a weight of expectation, as if creation itself was holding its breath. He stepped outside his tent and immediately understood why. They were coming. Not in the chaotic rush one might expect, but in ordered procession that defied every natural instinct. From the eastern forests emerged pairs of deer, their steps measured and purposeful. From the southern plains came antelope and wild cattle, moving with the same unhurried determination. The sky filled with birds flying in formation toward the ark, their calls creating a symphony unlike anything heard since the world began. Noah's family gathered around him, watching in silent awe as the procession continued. Ham pointed toward the northern hills where larger shapes were descending. Bears that should have been preparing for winter slumber walked alongside wolves that should have been hunting. Leopards padded silently next to sheep, their predatory instincts somehow suspended by divine command. The most remarkable sight was not the animals themselves, but their behavior toward one another. Natural enemies walked side by side without aggression. Prey animals showed no fear of predators. It was as if the very curse that had set creation at odds with itself had been temporarily lifted, revealing a glimpse of the harmony that had existed in Eden's perfect garden. Shem's wife had tears streaming down her face as she watched this impossible parade. "How beautiful they are," she whispered. "How perfectly they come when called." Even the children, who had grown accustomed to the unusual over these years of building, stood transfixed by the majesty of what they were witnessing. The human spectators who had gathered to mock found their voices caught in their throats. What they were seeing challenged every assumption they held about the natural world. Some dropped to their knees, overwhelmed by the undeniable presence of divine power. Others backed away in fear, their earlier laughter replaced by uneasy silence. For 7 days this gathering continued, each dawn bringing new arrivals. Creatures Noah had only heard described in travelers' tales appeared at the ark's entrance. Massive beasts with trunks like serpents and ears like great leaves, striped horses that weren't quite horses, spotted cats larger than any known in their region. Each pair moved with the same calm purpose, as if they understood perfectly what was required of them. The loading process began with the largest animals, those that would need the most space and the strongest floors. Noah had prepared special stalls in the ark's lower level, reinforced with extra beams to support creatures whose weight might otherwise compromise the vessel's integrity. These gentle giants entered without coercion, guided by invisible hands to their designated spaces. Next came the middle-sized animals, filling the ark's second level with a diversity that represented every corner of the known world and beyond. Creatures of forest and plain, mountain and valley, each finding their place in the great wooden sanctuary. The sounds they made created a constant background music, not of distress, but of settling, as if they too understood the significance of what was happening. The birds presented their own unique challenge and wonder. They flew directly to perches that had been prepared for them, arranging themselves according to size and species, with precision that no human organization could have achieved. Their songs filled the upper reaches of the ark, with melodies that seemed to celebrate rather than mourn their confinement. Throughout this loading process, Noah's family worked tirelessly to ensure each creature's comfort and security. They distributed hay and grain, filled water troughs, and checked that every pen was properly secured. The work was exhausting but exhilarating, each animal safely housed, representing another small victory against the coming catastrophe. The crowds that gathered to witness this supernatural event grew larger each day. Word had spread far beyond their local region, drawing people from distant settlements who came to see if the stories they had heard could possibly be true. Some came as skeptics, others as seekers, but all left changed by what they witnessed. Among the watchers stood merchants who had travelled trade routes across vast distances, yet had never seen such a collection of animals in one place. Scholars who prided themselves on their knowledge of the natural world found themselves observing creatures that challenged everything they thought they knew. Even priests from distant temples came to witness what some were calling the greatest wonder since creation itself. Yet, despite these miraculous signs, despite the undeniable evidence of divine intervention, most hearts remained unchanged. The same pride that had corrupted the pre-flood world now prevented people from acknowledging what they were seeing. They created explanations that satisfied their need to maintain control, suggesting Noah had somehow learned ancient secrets of animal control or had made bargains with powers they didn't understand. A few, a precious few, began to reconsider their rejection of Noah's warnings. Some approached him during the loading process, asking quietly if there might still be room for additional passengers. But even these late inquiries carried more curiosity than genuine repentance, more fear of consequences than sorrow for sin. Noah's response to these last-minute requests was gentle but firm. The ark's dimensions had been specified by divine command, its capacity determined by heavenly wisdom. Every space had been allocated according to purposes he didn't fully understand, but trusted completely. Most importantly, entrance to the ark required more than fear of drowning. It demanded the kind of righteousness that came from walking with God through years of faithful obedience. As the final animals entered, and the great door remained open for just a few more precious hours, Noah stood at the threshold one last time. Behind him stretched the ordered world of the ark, filled with life preserved by divine mercy. Before him lay the chaotic world of humanity about to face divine judgment. The contrast could not have been more stark. His heart ached for those who would be left behind, even those who had mocked and scorned his mission. These were his neighbors, people he had known for decades, families whose children had once played alongside his own. The coming flood would show no favoritism, making no distinction between the merely indifferent and the actively wicked. All who remained outside the ark would face the same watery fate. Yet Noah also felt a deep peace settling over his spirit. He had been faithful to his calling, obedient to every instruction, careful to preserve what he had been commanded to preserve. The burden of responsibility that had weighed on him for so many years was about to be lifted, transferred to the same divine hands that had guided every step of this incredible journey. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hillside as the last preparations were completed. Food stores had been secured, water vessels filled and sealed, waste management systems tested and approved. Every detail that human wisdom could anticipate had been addressed. The rest would require divine provision and protection. As evening approached, the crowds began to thin. Some left with reluctant admiration for what they had witnessed, others with hardened hearts that rejected even the clearest evidence of supernatural intervention. A few lingered, perhaps hoping for some final sign or last-minute reprieve, but most simply returned to their normal lives, convinced that whatever was happening on Noah's Hill was someone else's concern. The family gathered for what they knew would be their final meal on solid ground. They shared bread and wine, simple foods that tasted somehow more precious, knowing they were the last they would eat under an open sky for many months to come. Their conversation was quiet, reflective, tinged with both sadness for what they were leaving behind and anticipation for what lay ahead. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Noah felt the familiar presence of the divine voice speaking once more to his heart. Tomorrow, he was told, would bring the beginning of the end. The rain would start gently, perhaps mistaken at first for an ordinary shower. But it would not stop. For 40 days and 40 nights it would fall, joined by waters bursting forth from the deep places of the earth. The time for warnings had passed. The time for building had ended. The time for gathering was complete. Now came the time for floating, for trusting, for riding out the storm in a vessel built by faith and sealed by promise. The old world would die in those waters, but from its grave would emerge something new, something cleansed, something worthy of the rainbow covenant that would arch across the clearing skies. The morning of the flood dawned with deceptive tranquility. Birds sang their usual songs, unaware that this chorus would soon be silenced. The sun rose as it had for countless ages, casting golden light across valleys that would never again know its warmth. People in distant settlements began their daily routines, tending fires that would be extinguished, opening doors that would never close again. Noah stood at the entrance of the ark, his weathered face turned toward the horizon. The air felt different today, heavy with moisture and expectation. His sons joined him, their wives gathered close, the grandchildren clinging to familiar hands as they sensed the gravity of the moment without fully understanding it. Then it began. A single drop struck Noah's outstretched palm, warm and heavy, then another. Within moments, what started as scattered droplets became a steady patter, then a drumming, then a roar that seemed to come from heaven itself. The fountains of the great deep burst forth simultaneously, as if the earth's very foundations were cracking open to release waters that had been held in reserve since creation's first day. The family retreated into the ark as the deluge intensified. Outside, they could hear voices beginning to rise in alarm as people realized this was no ordinary storm. Shouts echoed across the valley as communities that had ignored Noah's warnings for years suddenly understood their peril. But the massive door of the ark had already begun to swing shut, moved not by human hands, but by divine will, sealing 8 souls safely inside, while sealing the fate of all who remained without. Inside their wooden sanctuary, the family felt the first subtle movement as the ark began to lift. After years of resting on solid ground, the vessel that had seemed so impossibly large now floated with surprising grace. The sounds from outside grew muffled, then distant, then finally faded altogether as the waters rose above the voices of those who had rejected salvation. Days passed in a rhythm of rain and rising water. Through the ark's small windows, they watched familiar landmarks disappear beneath the flood. Hills that had defined their horizon since childhood vanished like stones dropped into a pond. Trees that had stood for centuries became driftwood floating past their sanctuary. The entire geography of their world was being erased, rewritten by waters that recognized no human boundaries or achievements. The animals settled into their new reality with remarkable calm. Perhaps they possessed some instinct that helped them understand this confinement was temporary, necessary, protective. The larger beasts rested quietly in their stalls, while smaller creatures found comfort in the routines of feeding and care that Noah's family maintained despite their extraordinary circumstances. For 40 days and 40 nights, the rain continued without pause. The family marked time by the rhythms of animal care, the cycle of meals, the progression from grey dawn to grey dusk, visible through their limited windows. They told stories to pass the long hours, shared memories of the world that was, and spoke quietly of hopes for the world that would be. Noah often stood alone in the upper reaches of the ark, listening to the endless percussion of rain on the roof above. Sometimes he thought he heard echoes of voices in that sound, remnants of prayers offered too late, or cries for mercy that would not come. These moments filled him with profound sorrow for what had been lost, even as his faith remained unshaken in what had been preserved. When the rain finally ceased, the silence felt almost physical. For weeks they had lived with the constant drumming of water against wood, and its absence created a void that seemed to echo through every chamber of the ark. But though the rain had stopped, their journey was far from over. The waters continued to rise, fed by the fountains of the deep, until even the highest mountains disappeared beneath the surface of a world transformed into ocean. For 5 months they drifted, carried by currents they could not see toward destinations they could not know. The ark became their entire universe, its wooden walls containing all of life that remained on Earth. They were the keepers of creation's future, the guardians of genetic diversity, the living bridge between what had been and what would be. Gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, the waters began to recede. It started with a slight change in the ark's movement, a subtle shift that suggested they were no longer floating freely but occasionally touching something solid far below. Then came the morning when they felt a gentle bump, followed by stability. The ark had come to rest on Mount Ararat, its long voyage finally ended. The dove that returned with an olive leaf in its beak brought more than botanical evidence of the Earth's recovery. It carried hope made visible, life reasserting itself, the promise that what seemed dead could live again. When Noah opened the ark's door and stepped onto solid ground for the first time in over a year, he fell to his knees not in exhaustion but in gratitude. The world that greeted them was simultaneously familiar and foreign. The basic geography remained, mountains and valleys and plains, but everything had been washed clean, scoured by waters and renewed by time. It was a world ready for replanting, ready for rebuilding, ready for the second chance that divine mercy had provided. Noah's first act was to build an altar, gathering stones from the newly dry earth to create a place of worship and thanksgiving. The smoke that rose from his sacrifice carried with it the prayers of the only human family on earth, expressing gratitude for preservation and hope for blessing on their new beginning. The rainbow that appeared in the clearing sky was more than meteorological phenomenon. It was covenant made visible, promise painted in light across the heavens. Never again would flood destroy all life. Never again would water be the instrument of global judgment. The bow of war had been hung up in the clouds, its colours declaring peace between heaven and earth. From this family of 8, the world would be repopulated. Their descendants would spread across the continents, carrying with them the memory of judgment and the promise of mercy. They would build new cities, plant new fields, write new histories, but always with the knowledge that they lived under a covenant of grace, symbolized by bands of color that appeared when storm clouds cleared. The story of the flood becomes our story too, for we are all children of those who survived the waters. We inherit both the warning of what happens when creation rebels against its creator and the promise that mercy endures even through judgment. We live under the same rainbow covenant, reminded with each colorful arc across the sky that second chances are possible, that new beginnings can emerge from endings, and that hope floats even on the deepest waters. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let these ancient waters carry you not toward judgment, but toward peace. Let the gentle rocking of that wooden ark become the rhythm of your rest. Let the promise of the rainbow color your dreams with hope, and let the God who preserved Noah's family through the flood watch over your own journey through the night, carrying you safely from the day that was into the day that will be. The flood is over. The waters have receded. The dove has returned. The rainbow shines. Life continues, blessed and beloved, under skies that remember mercy and promise renewal with every storm that passes and every dawn that breaks clear and bright with possibility. Sleep well, fellow traveler. Your ark is strong, your pilot faithful, your destination sure.